You ever notice how trust doesn't break loudly? It cracks softly, right behind a smile. Someone you love listens to two friends who really think they know you, measure you, define you without ever standing where you stood. They laugh with you, nod at you, then whisper versions of you that fit their comfort, not your truth. And suddenly, you're not fighting one doubt, you're fighting three reflections, staring back, all slightly twisted, all pretending to be honest. That's how the game works, not with enemies, but with familiar faces who swear they're helping while quietly deciding. Who you're allowed to betrust doesn't collapse. It erodes, and that's the part nobody prepares you for. People expect explosions, screaming matches, slammed doors, something dramatic enough to justify the damage. But that's not how it usually goes. It starts quieter than a held breath. A look that lingers half a second too long. A question that sounds innocent but carries weight. A pause where certainty used to live. You don't notice the first grain falling away because you're still standing on what feels solid. You tell yourself it's nothing, just a misunderstanding, just a bad day, just people being people. Erosion is polite. It waits. It doesn't announce itself. It lets you smile while it works. One comment here, wrapped as concern. One comparison there, disguised as advice. Someone says, I heard something, and suddenly you're explaining yourself for crimes you didn't commit. Trust used to mean benefit of the doubt. Now it means trial periods, constant reviews, silent evaluation. You feel it when conversations stop flowing and start circling. When answers are remembered longer than action, when apologies are demanded for things you never intended. The dangerous thing about erosion is that it convinces you to participate. You start adjusting your tone, choosing your words carefully, editing yourself like you're afraid of being misquoted. You offer more proof than necessary. You replay moments in your head, wondering where the crack began, blaming your timing, your honesty, your silence. Meanwhile, the ground beneath you keeps thinning. Nobody pushes you off. They just let the floor forget how to hold your weight. Trust doesn't shatter in one moment, because that would require honesty. Erosion thrives on plausibility. Everyone involved can claim innocence. No one feels responsible. I was just asking. I was only trying to help. You're overthinking. That's the beauty of it. The damage is real, but the hands are clean, and you're left questioning your balance instead of the ground. Over time, you notice the change in how you're seen. Not accused, just reinterpreted. Your confidence becomes arrogance. Your silence becomes secrecy. Your kindness becomes strategy. The same traits that once built trust now chip away at it, depending on who's describing you. You don't lose trust because of what you did, but because of what others decided it meant. And once meaning shifts, facts don't matter as much. Erosion teaches patience to doubt. Doubt learns to sit comfortably in the background, humming quietly, never loud enough to confront, always present enough to influence. You feel it in the way questions replace statements, in the way reassurance needs repetition, in the way love starts asking for receipts. Nothing is broken enough to leave, but nothing is whole enough to stay peacefully. What hurts most is realizing that trust isn't taken from you by strangers. It's worn away by people close enough to touch it every day. They don't hate you. They just listen more to echoes than to you. They collect fragments of your story from others, assemble a version that feels complete, and slowly replace the original without telling you. You're still there, standing, smiling, trying, while the outline of who you are gets redrawn without your consent. And when you finally notice how thin the ground has become, you hesitate to move. Because movement might be the thing that proves them right. So you stay still, balanced on what's left, hoping it stops, hoping trust remembers how it used to hold, knowing deep down that erosion doesn't stop because you asked nicely. It stops only when there's nothing left to take, or when you step away and let whatever remains fall on its own terms. Familiar smiles hide borrowed opinions, and that's what makes them dangerous. A stranger tells you who they think you are, you shrug it off. They don't know you. They don't matter. But when someone you recognize smiles while saying it, when their tone is warm and their eyes are kind, the words slide past your defenses. You don't feel attacked. You feel adjusted, like someone quietly moved the furniture in a room you thought was yours. These smiles aren't fake. That's the trick. They're real smiles, practiced over years of shared jokes and casual trust. The danger isn't malice, it's laziness. People love opinions when they don't have to earn them. They borrow thoughts from others because thinking for themselves would mean sitting with discomfort. So they take secondhand judgments, polish them just enough, and deliver them gently like they're doing you a favor. You'll hear it in phrases that sound harmless. I don't know, but people say I'm not judging. I just heard. You know how you come across, right? They never own the opinion. They pass it along, smiling as if that absolves them. The smile says friend. The words say suspect. And suddenly you're responding not to what you did, but to what someone else imagined you meant. Borrowed opinions travel fast because they're light. No responsibility, no context, no weight. They skip the hard parts of understanding a person and land straight on a conclusion. And familiar faces are perfect carriers. You trust them, so you trust what they carry. You don't realize that the opinion didn't start with them, didn't grow with them, didn't survive a single honest conversation with you. The smile makes it worse because it disarms you. You don't prepare a defense against kindness. You lean into it. You explain yourself with sincerity, thinking clarity will fix it. But clarity can't compete with repetition. Borrowed opinions have already been repeated enough to feel real. They don't need proof anymore. They've settled in, rearranged the narrative, made themselves comfortable. What stings is the lack of curiosity. If they really wanted to know you, they'd ask, not assume, but assumptions are easier. They don't require listening. They don't require patience. They just require someone else's voice to copy. And copying is safer than understanding, because understanding might force them to confront their own bias, their own influence, their own role in the distortion. Familiar smiles also give you the illusion of safety. You think, if there was a problem, they'd tell me directly. If something was wrong, we'd talk. But borrowed opinions don't want conversation. They want confirmation. So they poke at you, watch your reaction, collect expressions, tone shift, pauses, and then report back to whatever invisible jury they're feeding. You're not a person in that process, you're evidence. Over time, you notice how interactions change. Less warmth, more observation. Compliments feel measured. Jokes land with hesitation. You feel like you're being watched for consistency, as if one misstep will validate everything they borrowed, and the smile stays. That's the cruel part. The smile stays while trust thins, while doubt grows, while you start wondering which version of you they're smiling at. Borrowed opinions are louder than truth because truth requires presence. It requires being there when it's inconvenient. Opinions borrowed from others skip the messy middle and jump straight to a label. And once a label sticks, every action gets filtered through it. You don't get seen anymore. You get interpreted. The most unsettling realization is that these smiles don't see themselves as harmful. They think they're informed. They think they're aware. They think they're being careful. But caution without understanding is just judgment in a softer voice. And when enough familiar faces carry the same borrowed idea, it stops feeling borrowed at all. It starts feeling like consensus, like something you're supposed to accept about yourself, like a truth you somehow missed while living your own life. Two voices can outweigh one truth, especially when they agree with each other. Truth is heavy, but it stands alone. It doesn't shout. It doesn't campaign. It just exists, waiting to be recognized. Two voices, though, they lean into each other, nodding, reinforcing, repeating. Repetition gives confidence a costume. Suddenly the truth looks uncertain, and the echo looks convincing. It doesn't matter how clear you are when the room prefers harmony over honesty. One person saying what happened sounds like defense. Two people saying what they think happened sounds like perspective. That's how balance gets faked. Not by evidence, but by numbers. Not by understanding, but by alignment. When voices sync, they don't have to be right. They just have to be louder than silence. You can feel it when your words start losing weight. You explain something once, calmly, directly, believing clarity is enough. Then someone else explains you differently. Then another agrees. Suddenly your explanation needs backup, timestamps, witnesses. Your truth is put on probation, while their version walks in already trusted. You're no longer telling your story, you're defending it against a chorus. Two voices work because they feed each other confidence. One alone might hesitate. Two together sound sure. They fill gaps for each other, finish sentences, correct details in a way that feels collaborative. To an outsider, it looks solid, it looks considered. They don't see the missing pieces, the assumptions stitched together to look complete. They don't hear the truth because it doesn't harmonize. The lonely part of truth is that it doesn't multiply on its own. It needs listeners willing to sit with discomfort. But discomfort isn't popular. Agreement is. Agreement feels safe. So when two voices offer an easier story, one that doesn't require question, one that fits neatly into existing beliefs, people lean toward it, not because it's accurate, but because it's convenient. You start noticing how your presence changes the conversation. When you speak, the room tightens. When they speak, it relaxes. Not because you're wrong, but because your truth disrupts the balance they've already accepted. You're not arguing facts anymore. You're arguing comfort. And comfort always has more allies. Two voices can outweigh one truth because they turn doubt into a shared activity. One person doubting you feels personal. Two feels objective. It feels like a pattern. It feels like something you should reflect on. And suddenly you're the one doing the work, questioning yourself, adjusting your tone, trimming your honesty so it doesn't sound defensive. Meanwhile, their voices grow steadier, reinforced by each other's presence. What makes it worse is that those two voices don't need to be malicious. They just need to agree. They might genuinely believe they're helping. They might think they're being fair. But fairness disappears when truth is outnumbered. Intent doesn't change impact. Agreement doesn't equal accuracy. But it sure feels like it does when you're standing alone. You learn quickly that truth without support looks suspicious. It looks emotional. It looks reactive. Two voices sound measured even when they're guessing. They get the benefit of calm because they're not being challenged. You do. Every word you say is weighed against their agreement, not against reality. You're not heard as a person. You're heard as a variable. And there's a moment when you realize the fight isn't worth the breath, not because you're wrong, but because the scale is already tipped. You can keep talking, keep explaining, keep clarifying, but clarity can't compete with consensus. The room has decided which version feels safer to believe. Truth becomes something private, something you carry instead of share. That's when silence starts to look like peace. Not because it is, but because speaking feels like shouting into a padded room. Two voices continue, confident, unbothered, shaping the narrative as you fade from it. And the strangest part is watching people accept the louder story, knowing deep down it's thinner, flatter, easier than the truth. You're no longer asked to tell how it becomes a courtroom. Without defense, the moment doubt is allowed to sit at the table. At first, it doesn't look hostile. It looks like concern. Questions framed softly, pauses filled with glances, silence that feels heavier than words. You walk in thinking, this is still love, still a place where you're understood, and suddenly, you realize you're standing under a light, every word measured, every expression noted, no gavel, no verdict announced. Just an invisible process where judgment is already underway. In this courtroom, evidence doesn't have to be real, it just has to sound reasonable, a look taken out of context, a tone misremembered. A story told by someone who wasn't there, but spoke confidently enough to be believed. You're expected to respond calmly, rationally, perfectly, because any emotion will be marked as suspicious. Anger means guilt. Hurt means manipulation. Silence means admission. There's no right move, only wrong interpretations waiting patiently. What makes it unbearable is that you didn't ask for a trial. You didn't even know one was scheduled. Love was supposed to be the place where you could rest, where explanations weren't required for every breath. But now every action needs justification. You find yourself explaining intentions instead of feelings, defending character instead of sharing pain. You're not being heard, you're being cross-examined. The people you love don't raise their voices. They don't accuse you directly. That would be too honest. Instead, they ask questions that already contain conclusions. Why would you do it that way? Don't you think that looks strange? Can you see how that came across? Each question narrows the room, pushing you closer to a version of yourself they're more comfortable suspecting. You answer, and they nod, not in understanding, but in evaluation. In a courtroom without defense, your history doesn't matter. Past loyalty doesn't matter. Consistency doesn't matter. Only the current charge does, and it keeps changing shape. One moment you're careless, the next you're calculated. You try to remind them of who you've been, what you've done, how you've shown up, but history is dismissed as irrelevant, as if trust has an expiration date you somehow missed. The most exhausting part is that the jury lives in your head. Even when you're alone, you replay conversations, searching for mistakes, wondering how your words were twisted, imagining what was said about you when you weren't there. Love was supposed to quiet your mind, not turn it into a surveillance room. You start editing yourself in advance, predicting reactions, adjusting behavior to avoid future charges that haven't even been invented yet. In this courtroom, love speaks the language of fairness while practicing control. We're just trying to understand. We just want clarity. But clarity is never enough because the goal isn't understanding, it's certainty. And certainty only comes when you accept their version of events. Your truth is treated like testimony from a biased witness. Their doubts are treated like facts. You notice how quickly the benefit of the doubt disappears. Once, your mistakes were human. Now they're patterns. Once, your flaws were known and accepted. Now they're highlighted, discussed, dissected. Love stops feeling like partnership and starts feeling like probation. You're free, technically, but always watched, always one misstep away from another hearing. And the cruel irony is that you still care. You still want to be understood. You still explain, still try, still hope that if you say it the right way, if you're calm enough, honest enough, patient enough, the trial will end. But it doesn't, because a courtroom without defense isn't interested in resolution. It's interested in maintaining the structure. As long as you're explaining, they're in control. Eventually you realize that love doesn't disappear in this process. It changes shape. It becomes conditional, cautious, transactional. You're loved as long as you comply with the narrative, as long as you don't challenge the assumptions, as long as you accept that your role is to answer questions, not ask them. And you stand there under that light, knowing that the hardest part isn't being judged. It's being judged by someone who once knew your heart well enough to protect it, and now knows it well enough to put it on trial. Friends judge from comfort, not context. And that's how misunderstandings dress themselves as wisdom. Comfort is a soft chair, a familiar angle, a story that doesn't require you to stand up and look around. Context is work. Context asks you to leave your seat, walk into someone else's mess, and feel things that don't belong to you. Most people don't want that. They want a version that fits where they're sitting, something they can nod at without shifting their weight. A friend hears half a story and fills in the rest with what feels reasonable to them. Reasonable based on their life, their limits, their fears. They don't ask what you were carrying that day. They don't ask who pushed you, who drained you, who cornered you into a choice that didn't look good from the outside. They just decide, because deciding is comfortable. Asking would mean uncertainty, and uncertainty makes people restless. Comfort loves shortcuts. It loves labels, patterns, familiar explanations. You're always like this. That's just how you are. These phrases sound like understanding, but they're really conclusions built on convenience. Context would ruin those sentences. Context would complicate them, stretch them, force them to admit they don't know as much as they thought. So context gets ignored and judgment gets dressed up as clarity. Friends judging from comfort don't feel cruel. They feel justified. They sit in their own experiences and assume the world works the same way for everyone. If they handled something one way, you should have too. If something didn't hurt them, it shouldn't hurt you. If they wouldn't do it, you shouldn't have. Your circumstances become irrelevant because they don't match the blueprint in their head. You notice it when advice comes too quickly. No pause, no questions, Just solutions handed over like they're obvious. You should have just said no. Why didn't you leave? I wouldn't tolerate that. Each sentence ignores the invisible factors, the power dynamics, the timing, the consequences you were weighing in silence. Comfort erases complexity because complexity threatens confidence. Judgment from comfort also loves distance. The farther they are from the situation, the clearer they think they see it. They weren't there, so emotions don't blur their vision. They weren't involved, so consequences don't touch them. They call that objectivity. But it's not clarity, it's insulation. It's easy to be certain when nothing is at stake for you. Context would require empathy, and empathy requires vulnerability. It requires admitting that you might have done the same thing in their position or worse. Comfort doesn't like that mirror, so friends stay seated, passing verdicts that feel clean because they never touched the dirt. They confuse emotional distance with wisdom. What hurts is realizing that judgment from comfort doesn't come with curiosity. A friend who wants context asks before concluding. A friend who judges from comfort concludes before listening. They assume you had the same options they would have had. They assume you saw the same exits. They assume you felt safe enough to choose differently. And when you try to explain, they interrupt with, I get it, even though they don't. You start shrinking your explanation. You stop sharing details because they're not heard anyway. You learn that your reasons sound like excuses to people who already decided. So you keep things simple, surface level, safe, and the friendship shifts, not dramatically, quietly, less depth, more distance. Less truth, more performance. Friends judging from comfort also influence others. Their certainty spreads because it sounds confident. They retell your story with edits, smoothing out the uncomfortable parts, sharpening the parts that fit their judgment. Context disappears in retelling. What remains is a cleaner narrative, easier to digest, easier to agree with, and suddenly you're known for something you barely recognize. The strange part is how normal it feels to them. They don't see themselves as unfair. They think they're being honest. They think honesty means saying what feels true to them. But truth without context is just opinion with volume. And when enough friends share the same comfortable opinion, it starts to feel like fact. You're left standing outside your own story, watching people discuss it like a case study instead of a life. You want to tell them about the nights you didn't sleep, the choices that scared you, the reasons you stayed quiet, but you already know how it will end. Comfort doesn't bend. It doesn't adjust. It just judges and relaxes back into its chair, satisfied that it understands enough. Even if understand was never really the goal, your silence is rewritten as guilt long before anyone asks what it meant. Silence used to be neutral, a pause, a breath between thoughts. Now it's a confession people feel entitled to translate. You don't speak, and they don't hear restraint or exhaustion or dignity. They hear avoidance. They hear calculation. They hear something they're already suspicious of. Silence stops being absence and becomes evidence. The strange thing is how quickly the meaning gets assigned. Nobody waits. Nobody asks why you didn't speak. They decide for you. You stayed quiet because you had something to hide. You didn't respond because you couldn't defend yourself. You walked away because you knew you were wrong. Silence becomes a canvas. Everyone paints the same picture because it's easier than sitting with uncertainty. Speaking used to feel risky, but silence feels worse. Words can be misunderstood, but silence gets rewritten entirely. It gives people permission to finish your sentences in their own voice. They fill the gap with their fears, their bias, their assumptions. And once those assumptions are shared, silence stops being yours at all. It belongs to the story they've already told. What they don't see is the cost of speaking. They don't see the fatigue of explaining yourself to people who aren't listening. They don't feel the weight of every word being dissected, twisted, remembered incorrectly. Silence sometimes isn't guilt. It's self-preservation. It's choosing not to bleed in front of an audience that's already holding knives. But self-preservation doesn't look noble to people who want answers more than truth. You notice how silence is treated differently depending on who uses it. When others go quiet, it's called maturity, thoughtfulness, calm. When you do it, it's suspicious, it's strategic. It's framed as emotional manipulation or passive aggression. The same behavior, different judgment, because the verdict was written before you ever stopped talking. Silence also terrifies people because it removes control. When you don't explain yourself, they can't steer the narrative through your words, so they take over. They speak on your behalf. They say what you must be thinking, what you must be feeling, what your silence clearly proves. And the more you stay quiet, the more confident they become in their version, mistaking repetition for accuracy. There's a cruel expectation attached to innocence. Innocent people are supposed to fight, to plead, to perform transparency on demand. If you don't, you're seen as defiant or indifferent. But no one considers that constantly defending yourself erodes something inside you, that eventually you stop speaking not because you're guilty, but because you're tired of shouting into a room that only hears what it wants. Silence becomes a trap. If you speak, you're defensive. If you don't, you're guilty. Every option confirms the story already forming, and people tell themselves they're being fair because they gave you a chance to talk, ignoring the fact that the chance came with conditions. Say it the right way. Say it calmly. Say it convincingly. Say it without emotion. Say it without contradicting what we've already decided. What hurts most is how silence erases nuance. The truth often lives in complexity, in contradictions, in feelings that don't translate cleanly into sentences. Silence can hold those things, but guilt is simple. Guilt is easy to explain, so people choose the simpler meaning. They flatten your experience into something manageable, something they can judge without discomfort. You start realizing that silence threatens narratives because it refuses to cooperate. It doesn't validate assumptions. It doesn't argue with them either. And that unsettles people. They want closure, resolution, a neat ending. Silence offers none of that. So they force an ending onto it, one that casts them as perceptive and you as exposed. Over time, silence stops being a choice and becomes a sentence passed on you. People reference it like a fact. You never denied it. You didn't say anything back then. That silence said a lot. They talk about it as if it spoke, as if it stood up and testified against you. Your quiet moments become louder than anything you ever said. And the bitter irony is that if you ever do speak after being silent, your words are filtered through the guilt already assigned. They're seen as damage control, not truth. Too late, too rehearsed, too careful. Silence marks you, and everything after is interpreted as reaction, not revelation. So you learn that in a world eager to judge, silence isn't empty. It's dangerous, not because it reveals guilt, but because it allows others to write freely, confidently, mercilessly, while you stand there watching you. Quiet turned into a story you never agreed to tell. Perception replaced reality quietly, like smoke slipping through a crack in the door. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It just moves in, settles, and before you notice, it's the only thing people see. Reality, with all its mess and nuance, stays in the background, ignored, irrelevant, because perception is faster, simpler, easier to hold on to. People don't want the truth. They want a version they can manage, a version that fits comfortably in their minds. You notice it first in the small things. A glance misread, a tone misremembered, a pause interpreted incorrectly. One person tells another and suddenly your intentions are different. The smile you offered in honesty is now arrogance. The silence you kept in thought is now plotting. Reality doesn't matter because perception has already claimed the stage, dressed it in lights, and given it a script. Perception grows strongest when it's repeated. A story told once is a detail. Told twice becomes a narrative. Told 3 times, it's fact. People stop asking questions, stop listening, stop considering that your version might exist. Because perception has been rehearsed, polished, and handed out as a souvenir. Reality feels messy in comparison. Who wants messy when certainty is on the menu? You try to correct it. You speak, you explain, you insist that what they think isn't true. But perception doesn't like interruption. It doesn't bend for evidence. It ignores context, rewrites events, and reshapes characters. The harder you push, the more entrenched it becomes. Reality is passive, perception is aggressive, and perception has friends, echoes, nods, subtle reinforcements that remind you always that your truth is inconvenient. What's terrifying is how quickly perception infiltrates even your own mind. You replay conversations, moments, choices, asking yourself if maybe they were right. Maybe you did look arrogant, maybe the silence was suspicious. Reality is still there, unchanged, waiting to be acknowledged, but perception whispers louder. And because it's echoed by voices you trust, you start to doubt your memory, your judgment, your existence. Perception doesn't need malice to be effective. It thrives on assumption, exaggeration, and simplification. People take fragments of truth and combine them with imagination, filling gaps with what makes sense to them. And sense is subjective. It doesn't care if the real story is more complicated, more tender, more human. Sense just wants coherence, narrative, drama. It can digest without questioning itself. You notice the cracks in relationships first. Friends who once knew your patterns start reacting to this shadow of you that exists only in perception. Love gets filtered, admiration gets filtered, trust gets filtered, because perception has already decided what they should see. You're there, but you're also not there. You're speaking, but they're hearing something else entirely. Your intentions, your efforts, your presence, they're collateral in a story you didn't authorize. The terrifying brilliance of perception is its permanence. Once it settles, it doesn't need reinforcement constantly. It survives quietly, like a virus in the background, coloring every interaction. Every word you speak is now translated through it. Every action interpreted as proof or contradiction. Reality becomes optional, inconvenient, irrelevant. People don't check facts. They check alignment with what they already believe, and yet perception feels real to them. It's supported by emotion, by consensus, by repetition. They defend it with passion because they think they're defending truth. They wield it as justice because it confirms their instincts. Meanwhile, reality, the messy, stubborn truth, waits invisible, patient, unheard. You start living cautiously, aware that nothing you do is free from its filter. You speak less, reveal less, even think carefully, because perception will not forgive mistakes the way reality might. The world becomes a stage where you perform not who you are, but who perception has painted you to be. And the strangest part is that even when you know the truth, even when you see the reality clearly, it feels like fighting shadows, because the world had already decided to believe smoke instead of the fire. It came from you are punished for a story you didn't tell. And that's the cruelest trick of all. The world doesn't wait for explanations, for clarifications, for confessions. It takes what it wants from the fragments it finds, stitches them together with assumption, and hands you the verdict. Before you even realize there was a trail, you're blamed for decisions you didn't make, motives you never had, actions you didn't commit. And the hardest part is that it feels inevitable, like gravity, like the tide unstoppable and indifferent. It starts with whispers, small interpretations that gather weight. Someone mentions a moment, another adds a detail, and suddenly your silence, your hesitation, your very presence is evident. No one asks if your story differs. No one pauses to consider your truth. They just need a narrative, something neat, something digestible. Yours hasn't been provided, so they borrow pieces and invent the rest. You become the character in someone else's novel, a novel written quickly, recklessly, without your consent. Punishment doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it's subtle, quiet, almost invisible. A look that lingers too long, a tone of voice that carries accusation, a question that pretends to be curiosity but is really assessment. People act as if they're protecting themselves, as if they're uncovering the truth, but really they're enforcing a version of you that never existed. And because they don't see the harm, they're untouchable. You're the only one living inside the consequence. You notice it in the way trust shifts. People treat you differently, not because you've done anything, but because someone else's interpretation of you demands caution. Your intentions don't matter. Your explanations are ignored. You can try to speak, but your words are filtered through the story they've already constructed. Every act becomes proof of guilt in a drama you didn't write, a play where you were